Chapter 82. Drew's timing was impeccable, unlike that morning, and he and the inspector both entered the bar of the Green Man simultaneously at precisely 7 o'clock. "Drew, good evening!" The inspector welcomed him with a surprised smile. "Inspector, hello. Did you manage to speak to Casey?" Drew asked immediately. "I did. She says she doesn't mind sharing you for one night, but wants you all to herself tomorrow," the inspector replied with a knowing smile. "Glad to see you two getting along so well," he added. Drew could barely stifle his grin. "All in the name of improving relations with colleagues in other departments," Drew replied seriously, but with a hint of humour. "Good man. Very important we are all working together," the inspector smiled. He had noticed immediately that Drew had made more of an effort in his appearance tonight. He was dressed in quality shirt and trousers, the sort, the inspector guessed, that were only worn for special occasions. "Well, I applaud your efforts. I hope you don't feel too upset when she inevitably has to return to London," the inspector warned friendlily. Drew smiled, appreciating his consideration. "Inspector, I promise that you are worrying unnecessarily. I am bound to this town just as she is bound to London. She has her world and I have mine, but we met, and we found something, so we're making the most of it while we can," Drew replied happily. "Well, as long as you two have things worked out, then it's none of my business," the inspector nodded, and left it at that. "Shall we get going?" Drew suggested, obviously eager to see her again. They made their way outside and quickly located the car. The clouds were still brewing overhead, hemming the town in. The atmosphere felt crowded and claustrophobic. "Did you explain that we would be continuing our investigations this evening?" Drew inquired as they climbed in. "I did," the inspector replied, studying the clouds and hoping optimistically that the rain might stop for them. The weather did not improve for their journey, and they arrived at the Swan and Dove wet and blustered by an incoming icy wind. On their arrival, they removed their wet coats and made directly for the bar. "Good evening, Inspector. Nice to see you again." Abigail welcomed him warmly. "And you," the inspector replied with a smile. "What can I get you, Drew?" the inspector asked him. "I think I'd better stick with Coke tonight," Drew replied. "Right you are, love. Ice and a slice?" Abigail asked. "Yes, please," Drew replied with a smile. "And for you, Inspector?" "I'll have a pot of tea, please," the inspector told her. "No problem." She opened a bottle of Coke for Drew and filled a glass with ice from a plastic container behind the bar. She put them both onto a clean, dried towel on the bar, advertising Guinness, and a small avalanche of fizz scurried down the bottle. "I'll bring the tea over for you. I presume you'll be sitting with Casey?" Abigail asked, nodding to Casey's regular table by the window. She fished a slice of lemon out of a jar for Drew and dropped it onto the ice in the glass. "We will indeed, thank you," the inspector confirmed, and they made their way over to the table. Casey was lounging nonchalantly in her chair, flicking disinterestedly through a newspaper and sipping her wine. She looked up as they approached. "Good evening, Drew, Inspector," she nodded to them. "Nice of you to join us, Inspector. To what do we owe the honour?" "Oh, no particular reason," the inspector replied, making himself comfortable. "Though an update would be nice. I just felt like a little company this evening. I hope you don't mind my gate-crashing your dinner." "Not at all. I'm interested to hear how the case is going," she replied. Drew studied her carefully. He had been hoping they could have the evening to themselves, but she genuinely didn't seem to mind the inspector's presence, so he relaxed a little. He still half wished he could have her to himself, but was happy to have the inspector for company. "Well, more men have disappeared without a trace," the inspector informed her. "Oh dear, who's missing now?" Casey asked, rather shocked. "So far today we have lost Constable Atkins, Dr. Sparrow, and Charlie, the landlord from the Black Prince. Add these to the current missing men, and we are now missing everyone from the list of guests at the mayor's house last Sunday night," the inspector informed her. "And you think the men have gone into hiding? Are they connected with the body?" she asked. "I don't believe they have gone into hiding, and they are connected to the body that Drew discovered, though I still am not sure how," the inspector admitted. "We also discovered a pair of standing stones hidden in the copse," he added lightly. Casey did a double take for a moment. "Standing stones?" she asked, a little confused. "How do you mean?" "We found 2 standing stones hidden under a pile of earth amongst the trees," Drew told her. "Like Stonehenge?" she asked, agog. "Yes, but nowhere near as many stones," Drew nodded. "At least not yet," the inspector interjected. "Who knows what they might find up there?" "They're huge," Drew continued. "Who found them?" Casey asked. "The inspector found the mound in the middle of a forgotten corner of the copse, whilst out on a walk," Drew informed her, with an eyebrow raised doubtfully that the inspector pretended not to notice. Casey stifled a giggle. "Well, that sounds very exciting. Any chance I could get up there and have a look?" she asked hopefully. "Yes, of course. Why don't you come up tomorrow?" Drew asked. "If that's all right, Inspector," he checked respectively, not wanting to get above his station. "Well, tomorrow's events depend on how things go tonight, but you are welcome to come and see the site. The stones are a wonder to behold if you think you can spare the time." "Well, fascinating as the decaying bones you have provided me with are, I am sure an hour out of my day would not make much difference." "How goes the search for the bones to bury?" the inspector asked. "I've sorted through them all. There were a few I wanted to look at before Sunday, but otherwise they're ready for you," she told the inspector, pleased with herself. "Well, why don't I telephone you at the morgue tomorrow when we know how the time stands, and we'll arrange a pick-up," the inspector suggested. Good idea, Casey agreed, just as Abigail arrived with the inspector's pot of tea. She set it on the table for him. "Well, my dears, are you eating with us tonight?" she asked Drew and the inspector. "We will be, yes," the inspector replied for them. "May I have the roast lamb with all the trimmings I noticed on your specials board?" he asked. "Of course, my love." She whipped out her notepad and began scribbling. "What about you two? What can I get you?" She turned to Casey first. "I'll have the liver and onions, please," Casey replied without having to study the menu. "I'll have the lamb with the inspector, I think," Drew replied. "A good choice," the inspector concurred, nodding. "Right you are, my dear, it won't be long." Abigail smiled and made her way through to the kitchen where she barked instructions to her long-suffering husband. The food was with them in record time, piping hot and smelling delicious. The dining area was quiet this evening. The salesman had moved on to new hunting ground. The only other patron with them being a lonely local sat in his regular corner, nursing his pint of ale and smoking roll-ups. "So how long have you been in the force, Inspector?" Drew asked as they tucked in. He realised suddenly how little he knew about him, and was feeling confident enough in his company now to pry further into his personal life. "Longer than I care to remember," the inspector replied, as vague as ever. "I started off in a similar position to you, Drew, local Bobby on the beat, so to speak." His eyes clouded over dreamily for a moment as he was lost to a reminisce. "Funny, isn't it, how time changes us?" he asked abstractedly. "Such subtle movements, such small changes building day after day. Then you turn around and you suddenly see behind you all the changes at once, all the people you have been, the young man you used to be that you had forgotten, left behind in the pursuit of growth, in the hurricane that is our continual wish to improve ourselves and the society we are thrown into it. The casualties in this fight are ourselves, or at least our former selves. The people we used to be are a foundation on which we blindly build, not knowing what will become of us, or where our adventures will lead." Both Drew and Casey had stopped eating for a moment to listen. It was as if the inspector had let his guard down for a moment, as if he had forgotten where he was and whom he was talking to. The best we can hope is that in our short time we can add a little of ourselves to the hurricane, that it is a little calmer, or at least a little easier for the next generation to cope with. And yet our lives will flash past us before we even realise we are here. He smiled an ironic smile for a moment, and they all fell into a thought. "I could of course advise you two not to let it happen to you. Advise you that you should enjoy every moment, embrace life and the challenges it throws your ways, but alas, I am afraid that the wisdom of the young would overshadow any guidance I could pass on. You are of course already walking paths of your own. All I can offer is what little I have learnt on my path." He spoke as though he might never see either of them again, and these might be his last words. He paused to chew appreciatively on his dinner. "I think lamb has always been my favourite food," he told them suddenly. "It's good to take moments to enjoy the things in life that mean something to you. Good food, good company." He waved a hand at his company. "Such a shame that it is only through experiencing life's monsters that we should come to appreciate the beauty." It sounded to Drew as if perhaps the inspector had experienced more monsters than anyone. "The trick, of course, is to not allow them to take over. You have to stop and see the beauty, or they win. They can shape the small, seemingly insignificant changes that shape us, and before we know it, we are monsters too." He put down his fork and poured another cup of tea. He spoke airily to keep the atmosphere light and friendly. "And we wouldn't want that," Casey interjected, raising her wine glass elegantly as means of a toast. "Quite," Drew agreed, "to not becoming monsters." They raised their glasses and a cup, and relaxed into the evening. The inspector didn't take the conversation any further. He spent the evening taking great pleasure in watching Drew and Casey enjoying each other's company. They all chatted and laughed, the inspector surprising Drew and Casey with his occasional bursts of openness. He allowed his guard to be lowered, and the evening was happier for it. After what seemed only a fleeting moment, the inspector was complaining that his tea was cold, and on checking his watch, Drew realised that the hour had slipped to 10 o'clock. "We'd best be getting back, Inspector," Drew informed him regrettably. He was unwilling to leave the company of Casey, and nervous as to what lay ahead for him in the remainder of the night. "Yes, we should indeed, Drew, thank you." They stood and prepared for the off. Casey stood with them and waited for them to get ready. "I'll put dinner on my tab, Inspector," Casey informed him as he pulled on his coat. "Oh yes, thank you. I'll just visit the gents. Won't be a moment, Drew." The inspector headed off, leaving the two of them alone. There was a moment while they waited for the toilet door to close, before they turned to each other in silence, which was immediately broken by a nervous laugh from Casey. "Should we take this opportunity to embrace life, and the opportunities it throws our way?" she suggested, moving closer to him and slipping her arms round his waist. Drew smiled, but she didn't give him a chance to reply, kissing him gently on the lips. It was over all too quickly for Drew's liking, and as she pulled away and stood apart from him, the toilet door opened and the inspector returned. "Well, gentlemen, an absolute pleasure as always," she informed them. "Hopefully we shall see each other tomorrow." "Yes, we shall be in touch," the inspector agreed. "Good night, Casey." "Good night, Inspector." She nodded to him and he turned to go. "Good night, Abigail," he called to the bar as they walked past. "Yes, good night, Inspector," she called back from her crossword behind the bar. "Good night, Drew," Casey called after him as he left. He turned to see her dark, sparkling eyes staring at him for one last moment before heading out into the cold winter air. Well, that was a fine meal, the inspector noted as they pulled away into the night. He looked out at the bleak sky between Nettlewood and Firestone. I wonder what the weather will hold for us tonight, he mused to the blackening canopy. The car's heater did little to warm them against the chill. It might clear later, Drew wafted optimistically, but it was difficult for him to add any enthusiasm to the idea. What is it exactly I'll be doing tonight? He asked as the car trundled through the desolate landscape. Well, you'll be my guardian of sorts, the inspector explained. I'll be attempting to do something that will help me calculate what is happening in the woods around Firestone. I have tried something similar a few days ago and got into a little bother. This time I'm being more careful, but it is likely that I may need some assistance following my attempt. More will become clear later, I hope. They arrived at the Firestone roundabout and headed straight on toward the town. The streets were hollow and empty. The town had lost all colour. A sickening grey had swept over, leaving it ashen and cold. They arrived at the Green Man in silence, the cold bearing into the car with them. The inspector opened his door and climbed out. He turned to Drew. "Meet you up there," he said, with a comforting smile through the dark. "Yes, see you later then, Inspector," Drew replied. The inspector watched him drive off into the black night before entering the pub. A few of the locals remained, even at this late hour, though as last orders approached they realised they would soon be forced out into the cold, dark night. The door creaked shut behind him, and Mavis appeared behind the bar from the side door as if she had heard its slow, whining closure. "Oh, good evening, Inspector. What can I get you?" she asked with a smile as she manned the bar. "Oh, nothing at the moment, thank you. I just wanted to warn you that I'll be heading out tonight quite late and returning even later. I will do my best not to disturb you, of course, but wanted you to know in case you wondered what I was up to." "Well, thank you for letting me know. We have heard you creeping out on a few nights. We are beginning to wonder if you sleep at all," she half-joked. "Well, Her Majesty is a strict timekeeper, I have to say," he quipped back. She humoured him with a polite laugh. "I hope I didn't disturb you too much." "We don't mind you coming and going. All I ask is you make sure the door's locked tight behind you when you go out, which you obviously do anyway." "Of course, I wouldn't dream of doing anything otherwise," he replied. "Now if you'll excuse me, I shall be in my room," he smiled. "Yes, Inspector, good night." Mavis nodded and he made his way up to his room. He was comfortable enough now with the layout of the building to be able to move silently along its corridors without switching the lights on. He hated disturbing his host with his late-night investigation and much preferred to move about at night without making any noise. Safely in his room, he made straight for the bathroom and poured himself a pint of water, which he drank down in one go. He then drank another, and another. He then moved to the dresser in his room and opened a drawer, inside which were a selection of pills and bottles. He took 2 tablets from a small orange bottle and put them in his mouth one at a time, washing them both down with a pint of water each. He then took 2 red ones from a separate bottle. He then sat studying his map and carrying out some careful calculations as to his chances of exiting through the 347 later. Chapter 83. The trees around the stones shook and split. They watched and ached, expectant, wanting. The stones stood tall and proud, defying their hiding place. Suddenly, through the black, cold trees, an engine roared. Sliding across the muddy path, a van's wheels skidded and scraped as it made its way to the standing stones. The van stopped, the sound of its engine spreading out amongst the trees. From the cab, 2 men exited, leaving the motor running. They leapt down and slammed their doors behind them. The noise echoed horribly amongst the branches. The trees studied and probed them, but their step was brash and determined. No fear stood between them and their job. They marched to the back of the van and threw open the doors. It was a large van, not unlike one a removal firm would use. They were dressed all in black, and with their black van their shapes were barely visible in the night. One of the men climbed into the back of the van and carefully wheeled a large wooden crate onto a loading platform that the second man was preparing. The crate was larger and heavier than the man, standing 8 feet tall and 4 feet squared. When the platform was prepared, the man positioned the crate on it, and the second man pressed a button on the side of the van. The platform's electric engine emitted a high-pitched hum as it struggled under the weight, and it soon began to lower itself towards the ground. The man then moved the large crate awkwardly through the mud with his colleague's help. When it was positioned securely, the 2 men returned to the van and put the platform back to a safe position. They then returned to the cab of the van and drove away back into the darkness. The trees returned to silence, but now something new stood between them, something unknown, but they would not have to wait long to discover what it was. Chapter 84. Drew arrived at the site earlier than he had arranged to, his neatly pressed uniform under Wellingtons and wax jacket. He followed his torchlight up the muddy path towards the stones. The rain that had battered him persistently from the moment he had closed his front door had thankfully retreated. The clouds gathered about the copse, as if being kept at bay by an unseen foe. The moon suddenly emerged from behind a wisp of vaporous cloud, a thin sliver of silver in the sky. For a moment, Drew was taken back to Sunday night, and a vision of the body flashed in front of him on the dark mud for a moment, doing little to raise his enthusiasm for his night in the copse. He stalked carefully and silently up the path, resisting the urge to turn back. Crouching and creeping, he slowly approached the stones, unsure if he was hiding in the trees or from them. As he approached the rock columns that protruded so unnaturally from the earth, he noticed the flash of a torch, and saw up ahead a point of light bobbing about the stones. He approached carefully and quietly, the feeling of trespassing creeping in again, as if he was unwelcome. The inspector heard him from a distance, despite his care at being quiet, and he waited until he was close to welcome him. He stood now and turned to greet him. "Evening, Drew. So glad you could join me," the inspector welcomed him in a loud voice. "I appreciate your punctuality." The sounds of his words echoed and clattered amongst the trees. "Evening, Inspector," Drew whispered back, relieved to find the inspector there. He shone his torch to the equipment the inspector was setting up. "What's all this, then?" he asked. He flashed his torch at the area around the stones to see that the inspector had been placing a series of spiked metal tubes into the ground. The tubes were connected by a thick cable that came from a heavy-looking battery pack. The inspector had arranged them in a large circle around the two stones. "It's a frequency modulator," the inspector explained, "also known as a field enhancer. It will, I hope, ease the current erratic nature of the surrounding frequencies and create one large and safe enough for me to exit through." Drew thought for a moment. "I'm afraid I don't fully understand," he replied honestly, looking about him. "Where are you going?" "I am not sure, but I have a feeling that the missing men have been pulled somewhere beyond here, beyond the trees and these stones. A place separate to the copse, yet bound to it. The trees anchor it here somehow. It is a phenomenon of the same energy that is causing all the bodies to appear, the energy I've been detecting on my devices. I'm hoping if I can enter this place beyond the trees, I may learn how to stop it." Drew did not fully understand, but presumed the inspector knew what he was doing. If anyone other than the inspector had explained such things to him, he would have thought them mad. The inspector stopped preparing the field enhancer and turned to face him. "Why do you need me here? How can I help?" Drew asked, realizing that this may be more useful information. "Well, first of all, you can help me get this open," the inspector suggested. A mixture of excitement and trepidation lined his words. He flashed his torch into a dark corner and illuminated a huge wooden crate that Drew hadn't noticed hidden in the background. My, what's in there?" Drew asked. "A suit," the inspector replied, and casually leant down to his case. To Drew's surprise, he removed a crowbar and headed over to the crate. Drew followed, and watched as the inspector used the crowbar to begin prizing open one of the sides from the large wooden crate. Drew helped, and with their combined strength the side was off after a few minutes' work. They propped it up against the crate, and Drew tried to make out what the strange shape was lurking inside where it was too dark to see. "I've been through something similar to this before, and when I emerged I was unwell," the inspector explained when they caught their breath. "I was undernourished, dehydrated and exhausted, but I had been unprepared for the journey. This time I have taken some very serious precautions by arranging for this suit. Part of those precautions is having you here." Drew nodded, hoping he would soon learn what he was to do. "If my calculations are correct, I should disappear and reappear in the same place." He pointed at the space between the stones. "There should not be more than 24 hours between those two events. If there is, I need you to call this telephone number and make them aware. They will help." He pulled a card from his faithful briefcase that stood nearby. "Keep this number safe," he urged him. For a moment they both held the card. The moment lingered. Drew stared deep into his eyes. "I will, Inspector," Drew replied nervously. The inspector let it go with a nod, and Drew stashed it in a waterproof pocket of his jacket. "When I reappear, I do not know what sort of a state I will be in," the inspector informed him. His tone was serious, businesslike. "Please ensure I get back to my room at the Green Man safely, and that I receive medical attention from Casey, should I need it." Gone was the moment of openness they had shared over dinner. Now the inspector had work to do. "Of course," Drew replied, accepting the responsibility without hesitation, still mystified as to what it all meant, but determined to take care of this man should he need to. The inspector stood and studied the rods he had entered into the ground, then referred to a page of complicated calculations that he produced from his pocket. He measured out the rods carefully with a tape measure, and took several readings from one of his devices. He studied the batteries and turned some important-looking knobs. "Yes, I think that all seems to be in the right place," he muttered to himself, satisfied everything was how it needed to be. "Let's switch it on, shall we?" he asked Drew. "Yes, I'm eager to see what it will do," Drew replied with an eager nod. The inspector flicked a switch, and the power from the battery began to emanate through the thick wire and down into the rods. As they warmed, they began to glow an eerie orange. Drew watched them, wondering if this was what the inspector had been expecting. "Yes, look, it's working!" the inspector suddenly gasped. Drew looked up and realized he wasn't talking about the rods, but about the stones, or rather, the space between the stones. A film had appeared between them. The oil slick that the inspector had seen earlier had returned. It was ever-changing, flowing. It glowed ultraviolet, slowly growing in brightness. Drew was transfixed. He had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. The inspector removed an instrument from his bag and began taking measurements. Yes, as I'd feared, it is growing again. If we don't act fast, we might not be able to stop it from bursting. Bursting? Drew asked. Bursting or striking. I'm not sure how to describe what it does, the inspector informed him, but this, I am sure, is what is causing the bodies to appear in the copse. The energy builds up. It has nowhere to go. It is blocked. I thought that by removing the soil we might allow it to be released, but in fact it is now just building up quicker because the soil held it back. So now you plan to enter it to see if you can find out why it is still blocked? Drew asked, shocked. That is my main reason for entering. I should make it clear, Drew. Up to now this sort of phenomenon has only been theoretical. For it to come into existence is extremely improbable. There is something about the stones in the copse that draws an energy. It interacts with the magnetic field, it causes air pressure to drop, and it allows this to happen. He gestured at the iridescent film between the stones that they had both been marvelling. He took a moment to enjoy its beauty before reaching for his camera and beginning to take pictures. We have no idea what it is or where it came from, or how it got here, he informed Drew meaningfully. It is what we call a 111. The Department of External Affairs has been aware of their theoretical existence for a while, and we have prepared for them. As far as I know, this is the only one that has ever been recorded, and we are all rather excited about it. Do you think you would know if there had been another one? Would they tell you? Drew asked. This was a poignant question, and the inspector had to think for a moment. I think they would have told me by now if there had been another case like this. Any information they could give that would increase my chances of going out through it and coming back again would have been passed my way already. As they have not shared any such information with me, I think it is safe to say that this is the first. He began fiddling with something in the crate, and Drew held up his torch to help, illuminating a large white object of such an odd shape he wasn't sure if it was one large thing or many small things stacked up. This 111 seems to be accompanied by several 347s, the inspector told Drew. A 347 is a set of circumstances that seems to suggest some as yet unidentifiable sentient consciousness. Drew digested these words for a moment. A life form, he asked? Alien life? Yes, sort of, the inspector said, pleased Drew had worked it out. We call them 347s for short. He had finished his preparations. I'd stand back if I were you. I haven't driven one of these before, the inspector warned. Drew nodded and put greater distance between him and the crate while the inspector fiddled for a moment with something unseen. Then a door swung down, revealing a small opening and releasing a bright white light out into the area around the inspector. It cast his shadow large and looming about them, like a giant black creature filling the area, carpeting the mud and creeping up the trees. The inspector took a strong grip of something on the outside of the object, then pulled himself into it, the door closing automatically behind him, robbing the area of light again and plunging Drew once more into blackness. Drew waited for an anxious moment, wondering if he should do something, but lost as to what that something should be. As he waited, the object began to emit a low hum that echoed quietly around the area. Drew strained his eyes through the dark, shining the torch beam toward the crate to try and see what was happening, when small pinpricks of light started to illuminate the inner crate, and the unidentified shape within suddenly gained meaning. It suddenly revealed itself as a protective suit of monstrous proportions. It filled the crate completely, with the back facing him. As Drew watched, the suit was becoming more active. Then, to his amazement, it rose from the ground and floated in the crate. Drew stood in shock and watched as the inspector piloted it out of the crate and turned it to face the stones. At the front was a large domed windscreen. The surface was mirrored, and Drew wondered how the inspector was able to see through it. The suit was perfect gleaming white. It looked plastic to Drew, but he could not tell what it was made of. It had bulbous legs and arm compartments, marked with black rings around the elbows, knees and hips where the different sections met. He had watched, along with the rest of the world, the moon landings just a few months ago, and the similarity between the astronaut suits and this one was obvious. It seemed to Drew, however, that this suit seemed much sturdier and much more advanced. Drew reached into the inspector's case and found his camera and began taking photographs. Although he hadn't been asked, he presumed the inspector would want the moment recorded. As he snapped, the suit began moving again, heading straight for the stones. Drew walked to the other side of the stones and took pictures of it slowly approaching. As he watched, it reached the thin film, but it did not stop. The inspector guided the suit carefully, and as Drew watched, he exited through the space between the stones.